This is Mount Moriah, where over the course of some 4,000 years of history, 2 altars, 3 temples, and 2 shrines have been built. This is the place that is where Solomon built the first temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians, where Zerubbabel rebuilt that temple and destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans.
The burning of the temple took place on the 9th of Av, or Tisha B'Av in Hebrew. That day is to come and wail for the destruction of the temple. And you may see even people sitting and crying. It's an event which took place almost 2,000 years ago, and they still feel it as if it was yesterday.
And this is an extremely sensitive place, and because of this, the archaeological spade has never touched it. Even without excavations though, there's plenty of archaeological evidence that can be seen. So what I want to do is I want to back up. I want to go through the biblical account of all that's happened on top of Mount Moriah. And when we bring the historical and the archaeological evidence together, then the authentic location for Mount Moriah is extremely obvious. So please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out, helps get the content out. Also, the site that I'm covering today is Chapter 2 in my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. Thanks to all of you who have been ordering it. You've made it #1 on Amazon in archaeology. And I will leave a link in the description below where you can order a copy of the book. The Lord tells Abraham in Genesis 22:2, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. On a mountain I will show you." So Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son on a mountain that God will show him in the region of Moriah, and thus Mount Moriah. So Abraham and Isaac are making their way up the slope of Mount Moriah, and Isaac is noticing that they have the fire and they have the knife, and he asks his father, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb." So when Abraham reached the place that God had told him about, that is the top of Mount Moriah, then it says that Abraham built an altar there. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The lamb that the Lord provided was sacrificed in place of Abraham's son. This is a substitutionary sacrifice. The lamb died as a substitute for Isaac. In other words, the lamb died so that Isaac could live. So moving forward in history, in 2 Samuel chapter 24, we learn of a similar event that happened to King David. 2 Samuel chapter 24 says, "The Lord sent a plague on Israel. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, 'I have sinned.' The Lord told David to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen. David built an altar to the Lord and sacrificed burnt offerings, and the plague on Israel was stopped." So again, we have here a substitutionary sacrifice. We have the oxen dying for the sin that David had committed. This plague that was against Israel stopped when this sacrifice took place. In other words, the oxen died so that Israel could live. Now the key verse for knowing where these places were located is 2 Chronicles 3:1. 2 Chronicles 3:1 says, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." The only two places in the Bible that the name Moriah is mentioned is in Genesis 22:2, where Abraham is shown the mountain in the region of Moriah, Mount Moriah, where he builds his altar. And then in 2 Chronicles 3:1, we have Solomon begin to build the temple on Mount Moriah. So also in 2 Samuel 24:18, David builds his altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And then in 2 Chronicles 3:1, then we have also mentioned the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, where Solomon is building the temple. So 2 Chronicles 3:1 tells us that all three of these places are one and the same. The place where Abraham built his altar on Mount Moriah is the same place that King David later builds his altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which is also the place that Solomon builds the temple, which also has a sacrificial altar. And so the top of Mount Moriah is a very sacred place, and the theme that holds all these building projects together is as a place of sacrifice. So earlier in 2 Chronicles 2:6, we're given the purpose of the temple, where Solomon says that the temple was a place to burn sacrifices before God. I thought this would be something interesting to get the perspective of a rabbi on. So I sat down with Rabbi Ken Spiro to ask him about the purpose of the temple and the sacrificial system. Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." What about, like, for example, Leviticus 17:11, where it says that that it's for atonement, that the life of the animal is in the blood, and that it's for atonement?
It's part of this idea. Again, it's not the notion, oh, God's happy now, he's got his meat, but rather it's my recognition that I've done something that damages the world. You know, this animal this should be me. This should be me. It's seeing a life taken even of a living being. I would say the temple's a tool to achieve atonement.
And obviously that has a lot to do with animal sacrifice. I mean, thousands and thousands of animals were sacrificed in the temple system. Sure. And does the shedding of the blood of these animals, does that have to do with atonement, with forgiveness of sins?
Well, again, that's a very interesting topic. The word for sacrifice in Hebrew is korban, which comes from the word karev, which means to bring closer.
Here's how korban works. When the blood of an animal is applied to your sin, then God forgives you. This removes the sin that separates you from God, allowing you to draw close to Him.
What's the purpose of sacrifice? So if you look back at the word, which is karev, which is to come close, then the purpose of a sacrifice is for us to build a relationship with God. And people find that very weird, even religious Jews who understand that that's an ideal.
This is why it's so devastating when we have in 2 Kings 25:9 that the Babylonians set fire to the temple of the Lord. The one place that the Israelites were allowed to offer these atoning sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins had been destroyed, and the people had been exiled. This is also when they were allowed to come back from exile from the decree of Cyrus, why the first thing that they wanted to do was to go back to Jerusalem, back to the ruins of the temple, and rebuild the temple and reinstitute the sacrificial system. Ezra chapter 6 says that King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices. Let the governor of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site and repair its ruins. We learn in Ezra that the exiles, when they returned to Jerusalem, they weren't doing a new thing. They weren't building a temple in a brand new place. What they were doing is they were rebuilding the temple on its spot. What does that mean? It means that they built the second temple on the same spot that the first temple had previously stood. And that's why it also describes the rebuilding of the second temple as repairing the ruins of the first temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. We're told by the 1st century AD historian Josephus that Herod, meaning Herod the Great, started to enlarge the temple. He didn't build a different temple in a different location. He took the temple that was already standing and simply enlarged and glorified it. And this was the temple that was standing on the Temple Mount at the time of Jesus.
This is Herod's Temple Mount. This is the very Temple Mount which was witnessed by Jesus.
After Jesus was crucified, Is it true that Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed?
Crucifixion took place in Jerusalem around the year 33 of the Common Era. The Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans following the first revolt, which started in 66 of the Common Era, and 4 years later, in the year 70 of the Common Era, the temple got burned down by the soldiers of Titus, and after the battles ended, Titus and his army, his engineering forces, intentionally ruined the entire city of Jerusalem, as well as the focal point of Jerusalem, that's the Temple Mount, which is the heart, soul, and spirit of Jerusalem.
Jerusalem has such a rich history, and it's been destroyed so many times, and so many sieges against it and attacks against it. Would you consider this particular event to be one of the most dramatic that has ever happened here in Jerusalem?
Listen, those stones just behind me and behind you here are very talkative. They tell us a story, which is a most dramatic story, the most touching story. Looking at the stones, I can hear the voice of the sound of the stones collapsing and breaking the slabs of the street. I can hear the people around shouting. I can hear the hussing of the flames around. So with a little bit of imagination, those stones can become even more talkative than they are. You know, this is the most tragic event in the national historical memory.
Around AD 130, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a shrine on top of the Temple Mount. Jerome wrote, "In the place where once there was the temple, there was set up a statue of Hadrian and an idol of Jupiter." So now the site where the temple had stood had been desecrated, and we have Jerome as an eyewitness seeing this shrine that Hadrian had built with two statues, one of Hadrian and one of Jupiter. So during the Christian portion of the Roman Empire, called the Byzantine period, the Temple Mount remained bare. There were no buildings on it. And the Byzantines, who built churches just about everywhere, did not build a church on this site, but we're given the reason why in a historical source, where the Bishop of Jerusalem says that the reason that they didn't build a church is because of the prophecy of Jesus when he was speaking of the buildings on top of the Temple Mount, that there wouldn't be a stone left on top of a stone. And so this is the reason that the Christians in the Byzantine period did not build a church on this sacred site. So in AD 638, the Muslim Caliph Umar came into and took over Jerusalem, and he asked the Bishop of Jerusalem, "Give me a place which I might build a sanctuary." And the bishop responded, "It is the rock, and was a temple for the Israelites." So then it was a little bit later in AD 692 that another caliph named Abd al-Malik built the Dome of the Rock. And so, but it's important to understand that the Dome of the Rock marks the location. It was chosen as a location for where previously the first and second temple had stood. Over the course of thousands of years, on top of Mount Moriah, on this specific place, we have where Abraham built an altar, where David built an altar, where Solomon built the temple, where Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, where Herod enlarged the temple, where Hadrian built a shrine, and where the Islamic Caliph Abd al-Malik built the Islamic shrine that has marked the location of where these previous building projects have taken place for over 1,300 years. Here are some examples of the archaeological evidence that can be seen on and around Mount Moriah, starting with the latest evidence and working our way back through time. The Dome of the Rock takes us from the present back to AD 692 when it was built. Located just to the north of the western wall, in a prayer hall under this building, are large arches built by Hadrian around AD 130 to give access to the shrine that he constructed on top of Moriah. This pile of stones came from the buildings that stood on top of the Temple Mount. These buildings were destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 and pushed off the Temple Mount platform. The masonry of the western and southern Temple Mount walls dates to the time of Herod the Great. Herod extended the western and southern sides of the Temple Mount platform that already existed. You can still see a seam in the masonry that identifies the place where Herod's extension began. The masonry south of the seam is Herod's addition. North of the seam, some of the masonry belonging to Zerubbabel's Temple Mount still remains. The steps leading up to Herod's temple are seen here. This is one of the entrances to the Second Temple, and you can see the original steps here and some restoration of the steps. Some of the most dramatic evidence of the Babylonian destruction has been excavated here. Walls built by King Solomon have been unearthed here. We are in between the city of David and the Temple Mount here, and you see this tower here that's attached to a wall. And you see the later masonry above here, and then you see the older masonry down below, which is from the time of Solomon. These are the towers and walls that Solomon built to extend the city of David to the north, to take in Mount Moriah and build the temple on top. Though the location of David's altar can't be excavated, the city of David just to the south of the Temple Mount has been excavated extensively. David's palace was unearthed here. Layers found beneath the city of David date back to when the city was called Salem, which is when Abraham built his altar. The rock peak of Mount Moriah is the oldest physical evidence, which is hidden today beneath the Dome of the Rock. This is the rock that the Dome of the Rock is named after. So despite the fact that the Temple Mount itself has not been excavated, there is plenty of visible evidence from all the periods we have covered, left behind from the various events that happened on Jerusalem's holy hill. There is a teaching amongst Christians that's gained in popularity that argues that the temple did not stand on the traditional Temple Mount. And this is based on Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple, where he says that not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be cast down. So I'm standing just off the western wall of the Temple Mount. The western wall because it's the wall that's facing towards the west. Now we have this pile of stones all along the walls of the Temple Mount. These are evidence for the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy when he said, there won't be one stone left on top of another. Now what people are often told these days is that you look at the rows of stones that make up the Temple Mount platform itself, and they say, well, that can't be the Temple Mount because Jesus said there wouldn't be one stone left on top of another. Well, in order to understand the context of what Jesus is prophesying against and what he's not prophesying against, we need to understand what the Temple Mount is. So what we're talking about is the Temple Mount is a platform upon which the buildings were built, including the temple. And then when those buildings were destroyed, then those stones were cast down off of the platform?
That is very true. The Temple Mount is actually a mountain, a dome-shaped hill, which is put into a very large bottomless box. The box is made of retaining walls, gigantic retaining walls, sometimes a quarter of a mile long. And these retaining walls have behind them artificial fill between the wall itself and the slope of the mountain. That enabled to form a kind of a platform, a flat terrain, rather than a rounded dome-shaped hill.
Before Solomon could build a temple on top of Mount Moriah, he first had to build a Temple Mount platform, upon which he could then build the temple and his palace. Herod the Great extended the Temple Mount platform to the west and south. Here we see a distinction between the Temple Mount platform itself and the buildings that stood on top of it. Mark chapter 13 says, as Jesus was leaving the temple, his disciples said to him, "What massive stones! What magnificent buildings!" Notice they are specifically referring to the buildings. "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. every one will be thrown down. At the time of Jesus, the two magnificent buildings that were on top of the Temple Mount were, of course, the temple itself, and then the royal stoa. And Jesus spoke of these buildings that not one stone would be left on top of another. They all would be cast down. Well, what does that mean? Cast down off of what? Cast down off of the Temple Mount platform. And that's exactly what happened to the buildings up there, just as Jesus prophesied. They were destroyed, not one stone was left on top of another. They all were cast down off of the Temple Mount and came crashing down on this Roman street that I'm standing on now. That pile of stones came over this whole area here, but these stones were removed during archaeology to get down to the street level that you see here. And look at the impact that we have the evidence for in this street from where those stones came down off of the Temple Mount and smashed into this street level here. This is amazing archaeological evidence for the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. I wanted to bring out how obvious this evidence is. And so what I did was I interviewed the Israeli archaeologist Gabi Barkai. Gabi Barkai is Jewish. He's not Christian. He believes in the historical Jesus. He does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
Listen, I'm very objective. First of all, I'm an archaeologist and I'm not Christian. So I couldn't care less.
And so I interviewed Gabi Barkai in the pile of stones, the evidence, to show how obvious it is, even to him, that the words of Jesus came to pass. We're sitting here amongst this pile of stones, and I wanted to ask you, is there any archaeological evidence for the prophecy of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, that there wouldn't be one stone on top of another?
This is the evidence. This is the evidence. Look at it. It speaks for itself. Yeah. There is evidence in front of our eyes to the prophecy that came through. The temple and the entire city of Jerusalem were brutally destroyed by Titus in the year 70 of the Common Era. The destruction was intentional, pre-planned, and not a single building of Jerusalem was left, and not a stone upon a stone of the temple remained. So the destruction took place, and you can see the evidence right in front of your eyes.
Now, the other claim is that the Temple Mount is actually the Antonia Fortress. And again, we have to understand not only the purpose of the temple, but also the purpose of the Antonia Fortress. The Temple Mount platform has two polar opposite corners, the southeast corner and then the northwest corner. So this is the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, and the one that is the highest from ground level. We were just at the southeast corner, now we're at the northwest corner. The southeast corner is the highest off of the ground, and actually this northwest corner actually cuts into the bedrock, as you see behind me here. This is where the Antonia Fortress stood. Now, why did it stand here? Because this was the weak place of the Temple Mount. When Jerusalem was being attacked, this corner especially needed defense. And so there was a huge fortress here in order to provide that defense. To make the whole Temple Mount the Antonia Fortress doesn't make any sense. And then where is the temple itself? Oh, well, they say over the city of David. Well, the city of David has been extensively excavated, and the occupation layers from the time of the first and second temple period have been uncovered. And so how are people living in the city, in their houses, in their buildings, occupying the city if there was a whole Temple Mount covering at least a major portion of the city with a temple on top of it? It doesn't make any sense. It wasn't the Antonia Fortress that was the big deal in Jerusalem. It was the temple that was the heart and soul of Jerusalem. The authentic Mount Moriah is the Temple Mount because the temple was built on Mount Moriah. So of all the hills of Jerusalem, which one would be the authentic Mount Moriah. Well, how about the one, the hill, that has these ancient, massive retaining walls built around it? How about the hill that is literally covered by layers and layers of archaeological evidence that was left behind over thousands of years from the various events that took place on this sacred ground?
Now, one thing that's very interesting is the close proximity between two events that we have in the Bible. The first is what happens on Mount Moriah, where Abraham comes up and builds an altar and then offers Isaac on that altar, but is provided a substitutionary sacrifice with a ram caught in the thickets. And so he sacrifices that ram in place of his son Isaac. That happens here on Mount Moriah, which is marked by the Dome of the Rock today. Just to the right of it here, you see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the two silver domes. The silver dome closest to us with the cross on top, that marks the place of Jesus' crucifixion. This is the place where God provided a substitutionary sacrifice in the Lamb of God, the Son of God, and that is where he died for the sins of man. So think about how close these two events took place.
I want to end with two profound events that also took place on Mount Moriah, and the first one is found in John chapter 2. John chapter 2 says, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Think about this. This is the same place that God provided Abraham a lamb to die instead of his son Isaac. And in the same place now, Jesus is talking about the temple of his body, that he will die instead of us. So what Jesus is claiming is that his body is the superior temple that will provide the superior atonement. And the question then is this found in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament? And the answer is clearly yes. And probably the best example is Isaiah chapter 53. So the Israelite prophet Isaiah is prophesying about the coming of a person, this Messiah, and he calls him a suffering servant. And he says that the iniquity of us all will be laid on him, that he will be led like a lamb to the slaughter, and that he will be cut off from the land of the living. And then he says this, the Lord makes his life an offering for sin. This is substitutionary sacrifice. The Messiah would die instead of us. This is why, speaking of John the Baptist in John chapter 1, verse 29, when John saw Jesus coming, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world." This is the one Isaiah spoke of in Isaiah 53. This is the one who will become a sin offering on our behalf. We know that Jesus didn't die on Mount Moriah. Hebrews 13:12 makes it very clear that Jesus suffered outside the city gate. Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. But at the moment that he died, it affected a specific place. And that place was inside the city. That place was on top of Mount Moriah. And that place was inside the temple itself. Matthew chapter 27 says that when Jesus gave up his spirit, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The sacrifice of Jesus was the ultimate korban. This is why when the curtain is ripped from top to bottom, allowing man who has now been forgiven of sin to enter into the Holy of Holies, the very presence of God, to enter into intimate relationship with God, both in this life and the life to come. And how do we enter in? There's just one way, through the blood of Jesus. I hope that this video was meaningful to you. It's very supportive if you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps get this content out there. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can order a copy of my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. You can watch another video here, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.